In the summer of 1946, a joint excavation team operating under the authority of the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities began systematic excavation of a low, windswept mound in the southernmost reaches of the Mesopotamian plain, a site the ancient Sumerians themselves had called Eridu, and which they consistently identified in their earliest written records as the first city ever built upon the earth. What the archaeologists uncovered in the lowest and most ancient strata of that mound would quietly reshape scholarly understanding of human prehistory in ways that the mainstream academic community has never fully confronted. Buried beneath 17 successive layers of human occupation in deposits dating to approximately 5000 BC, they found not the crude dwellings and rough pottery that characterize the earliest phases of known human settlement elsewhere in the world. They found sophisticated architecture, precise construction geometries, and evidence of hydraulic engineering that should not have existed by any conventional model of gradual cultural development. More disorienting than the physical remains, however, were the clay tablets recovered from slightly later strata at this and surrounding sites throughout southern Mesopotamia. These documents, some dating to the earliest phase of cuneiform writing around 3200 BC, did not describe a civilization in the process of inventing itself. They described one that had already been thoroughly established and systematically governed for timescales that collapsed every conventional archaeological timeline. They described beings who possessed capabilities no human population of that era could have independently developed, and they described these beings not in the language of religious awe, but in the dry, methodical, cross-referenced prose of administrative record-keeping. The oldest tablets ever recovered are not origin myths. They are something far stranger and far more unsettling. They are documentation of a world that had already been running for an incomprehensible duration before a single human hand pressed the first reed into clay. They describe, with bureaucratic precision, who was governing that world, what technologies they operated, and what territories they administered. What follows is a systematic examination of what those tablets say, what the archaeology beneath the oldest known cities confirms, and what the convergence of evidence from genetics, linguistics, comparative mythology, and underwater archaeology demands that we seriously consider. The day before history began was not empty. Something was already there. The cuneiform tablets recovered from sites across the ancient Mesopotamian plain represent the oldest surviving writing system on Earth, with the earliest examples dating to approximately 3200 BC from the city of Uruk. For over a century, mainstream scholarship has treated these tablets primarily as evidence of the first emergence of complex administrative thought, the moment when human cognition became sophisticated enough to require external record-keeping. That interpretation, while superficially reasonable, collapses immediately upon careful examination of what those earliest tablets actually contain. They do not describe a civilization learning to organize itself. They describe a civilization that arrived on the archaeological record already possessing complex urban planning, standardized weights and measures, a base 60 mathematical system, advanced astronomical observation protocols, and a detailed hierarchical governance structure. The question that conventional archaeology consistently fails to answer is equally simple and devastating. Where did all of this come from, and why are there no intermediate stages anywhere in the record? The German Archaeological Institute's excavations at Uruk, conducted across multiple seasons between 1912 and the present day, have produced the largest single collection of proto-cuneiform tablets in existence. The earliest of these, assigned to what stratigraphic analysis places in the Uruk IV period, present scholars with an intellectual problem of the first order. These tablets, written before the full development of phonetic cuneiform signs, already employ a system of numerical notation that presupposes familiarity with the base 60 counting system. They already reference standardized units of grain measurement, standardized ratios for the allocation of labor, and hierarchical institutional categories that imply a governance structure of considerable complexity. Paleographer and cuneiformist Robert England of the University of California, Los Angeles, who has devoted decades to the analysis of the Uruk-archaic tablets, concluded in his comprehensive study of 2001 that the administrative system reflected in the earliest Uruk writing had no detectable period of experimental development. The system appears, in the earliest tablets we've recovered, already mature. This observation becomes even more striking when the content of slightly later tablets from the early dynastic period is examined. The tablets recovered from the site of Abu Salabik in southern Iraq, excavated by Nicholas Postgate of Cambridge University between 1973 and 1989, include some of the earliest known literary texts, documents that go beyond administrative record-keeping to present narrative content. These tablets, dated to approximately 2500 BC, describe events and beings from a period their own authors clearly regarded as remote antiquity. They reference cities that were already ancient when the tablets were composed. They mention beings who had already long since departed from direct earthly contact. The authors of the Abu Salabik literary tablets were not documenting their own era. They were copying from sources older than themselves, sources they explicitly identified as having originated before the great flood that divided their history into two irreconcilable halves. The physical properties of the tablets themselves offer additional evidence that the knowledge they contain predates their physical composition by an enormous margin. Cuneiformist Ulla Koch-Westenholz of the Carsten Niebuhr Institute in Copenhagen conducted detailed comparative analysis of the scribal conventions used in early Mesopotamian administrative and literary texts, and published her findings in 1995. Her analysis demonstrated that certain technical terms appearing in the oldest literary tablets employ grammatical forms and semantic conventions that are archaic, even relative to the period in which those tablets were produced. The scribes were copying formulations that their own language had already moved beyond, preserving linguistic fossils of an expressive system so old that it had become partially opaque even to the ancient writers transcribing it. This is precisely the pattern one would expect if the knowledge being recorded had originated in a period substantially earlier than the documents that preserve it. The architectural evidence from the earliest urban strata in southern Mesopotamia reinforces what the tablets suggest. The cities that appear in the archaeological record at the beginning of the Uruk period are not primitive. The lowest excavated levels at Uruk itself, reached by German teams under the direction of Ernst Heinrich in the 1930s, revealed monumental public architecture including the limestone temple complex covering an area of approximately 5,500 square meters, constructed from materials that had to be transported considerable distances across a largely flat and resourceless alluvial plain. The logistics required to quarry, transport, and assemble these materials presuppose an organizational capacity that the conventional developmental model of Mesopotamian civilization cannot account for at this early date. The city did not grow from a village. It materialized from elsewhere, already knowing what it needed to build. The implications of this evidential convergence extend far beyond questions of archaeological chronology. What the oldest tablets describe, and what the physical remains of the oldest cities confirm is a transfer rather than an emergence. The knowledge that powered the Sumerian civilizational explosion was not generated by the civilization itself. It was received. The critical question is who transmitted it, and the tablets themselves provide an answer that conventional scholarship has consistently declined to examine on its own terms. Among the most significant documents in the entire corpus of Sumerian literature is a fragmentary text first identified by archaeologist Arno Pobel in 1914 from tablets held at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, a collection now catalogued in part as CBS 10673. The document, which scholars assigned the working title the Eridu Genesis, had long been classified as one of the world's earliest flood narratives, a Mesopotamian precursor to the biblical account, interesting primarily for its mythological parallels. That classification fundamentally misrepresents what the tablet actually is. When examined alongside the dozens of corroborating documents recovered from Nippur, Uruk, and Shuruppak in subsequent decades, the Eridu Genesis reveals itself not as religious poetry, but as a structured administrative account describing the establishment of cities, the descent of kingship from a non-terrestrial source, and the deliberate decision by a governing council to reset human civilization through a managed catastrophic event. The language is not mythological, it is procedural. The fragmentary nature of the CBS 10673 tablet has long provided convenient grounds for conservative interpretation. The text is damaged, large sections are missing, and the surviving lines require considerable scholarly reconstruction to yield coherent meaning. But the surviving sections are revealing precisely because of how they differ from what a religious mythology would be expected to contain. The text opens not with a prayer, not with an invocation of divine majesty, not with the kind of cosmological poetry that characterizes the Babylonian creation epic the Enuma Elish. It opens with a structured description of administrative arrangements. It describes the determination of the functions of cities. It describes the assignment of divine oversight to specific urban centers. It describes the distribution of governance responsibilities among named figures in language that Sumerologist Thorkild Jacobsen of Harvard University, whose analysis of the document in his 1946 study of Sumerian theology remains foundational, compared explicitly to the language of institutional charter documents. The surviving section of the Eridu Genesis that describes the Antediluvian period before the flood makes no attempt to explain how civilization came into existence, because it treats that question as already settled. Cities already exist, kingship already operates. Divine oversight is already structured across a defined geographical domain. The text's narrative interest begins not at the foundation of civilization, but at the point where a decision is made to interrupt it. The passage describing this decision employs the Sumerian term inim, meaning decree or directive, a word used throughout administrative contexts to designate formal resolutions by governing authorities. The flood was not a divine tantrum. It was a resolution passed by a council and implemented through prepared protocols. This reading gains substantial support from the content of corroborating tablets recovered from Nippur during the University of Pennsylvania expeditions of 1888 through 1900. Among these, the tablet now designated as N3291 in the University Museum's collection contains a fragmentary account of what appears to be the deliberative process preceding the flood decision. The surviving lines describe competing arguments among named divine figures about the appropriate response to conditions on Earth. with one faction urging restraint and another insisting that the situation had reached a point requiring intervention. This is not the description of an impulsive deity. This is the record of an institutional policy debate with identifiable participants, articulated positions, and a formal outcome. The administrative vocabulary is consistent throughout, with documents describing actual governance procedures rather than mythological narratives. The text description of the flood's aftermath is equally revealing. Following the waters, the Eridu Genesis fragment describes the resumption of institutional arrangements, the re-establishment of cities, and the restoration of the governing protocols that had existed before the catastrophe. The Sumerian word used for this restoration carries connotations of reinstating something to a previously established condition rather than creating something new. The post-flood world, according to the oldest surviving narrative account of it, was not a new creation. It was a recovery. The systems that had existed before were restarted. What is particularly striking to anyone who reads the original Sumerian with attention to its administrative register is that the tablet does not treat this resumption as miraculous or unexpected. It reads like the activation of a contingency plan that had been prepared in advance and was executed precisely as designed. The broader significance of the Eridu Genesis as administrative record rather than mythology becomes fully apparent only when it is placed alongside the document that provides its primary context. That document is the Sumerian King List, the most mathematically anomalous text in the entire ancient Near Eastern corpus, and the one that presents the most direct and most devastating challenge to conventional models of prehistoric human governance. The Sumerian King List, preserved across multiple independent tablet copies, including the Weld Blundell prism now housed at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, and dated to approximately 2100 BC, presents what appears at first examination to be an obvious example of ancient mythological exaggeration. The document records the reigns of 8 kings who ruled before a great flood, assigning each of them governorship periods measured in thousands of years. Conventional scholarship dismisses these figures as symbolic inflation, designed to lend legitimacy to later rulers by connecting them to divine origins. That dismissal becomes intellectually indefensible the moment one examines the mathematics underlying the pre-flood reign lengths. Every single duration recorded for the Antediluvian kings is an exact multiple of 3,600, the number the Sumerians called a SAR, their largest unit of cyclical time. This is not exaggeration. This is not symbolic inflation. This is a consistent, mathematically precise system of time measurement applied with bureaucratic uniformity to a period of governance that the tablets insist preceded the world we know. The Weld Blundell prism, a 4-sided baked clay column, approximately 20 centimetres tall and 8 centimetres wide, was purchased by Herbert Weld Blundell on the antiquities market in 1922 and presented to the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, where it has been studied by successive generations of cuneiformists. The prism is not the oldest copy of the King List, which exists in at least 16 known versions ranging in date from approximately 2100 to approximately 1800 BC. It is, however, the most complete version, and it is the version that has yielded the clearest mathematical analysis of the antediluvian reign lengths. Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobson published the first systematic scholarly treatment of the document in 1939, and his foundational observation that the pre-flood reign lengths follow a consistent mathematical pattern rather than varying randomly established the basis for all subsequent analysis. What Jacobson identified and what later scholars, including Assyriologist Alastair Livingston and mathematician Joran Freiberg, have expanded upon, is that the antediluvian numbers are not simply large, they are structured. The smallest reign length recorded, that of the 5th antediluvian ruler Enmenlu Anna at 43,200 years, equals exactly 12 SR units. The longest in the series totals 36,000 years, equaling 10 SAR units. But it is the cumulative structure of the list that most forcefully argues against accidental generation. The 8 reigns sum to exactly 241,200 years, a figure that in the Sumerian base 60 system represents an astronomically meaningful value. In a numerical system based on 60, the appearance of this specific total across 8 independently listed values is not a coincidence achievable by random mythological invention. It requires prior calculation, and prior calculation requires prior knowledge of what that total is supposed to represent. The geographical distribution of the 5 antediluvian cities named in the King List provides additional evidence that the document records actual historical geography rather than mythological invention. The cities of Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurapak, each named as the seat of specific antediluvian rulers, are real places whose archaeological remains have been identified and in several cases substantially excavated. More significantly, their positions on the Mesopotamian plain correspond to what geologists have identified as the highest ground in southern Mesopotamia, the areas that would have remained above water during major flood events of the kind that geological evidence indicates struck the region repeatedly during the 4th and 3rd millennia BC. The antediluvian political geography preserved in the King List is consistent with what a civilization planning for survival against catastrophic inundation would have selected as its administrative centers, real places chosen for real reasons, governed according to a real numerical system whose mathematical properties we're only beginning to properly understand. The combined reign lengths of the 8 kings listed as governing before the flood total exactly 241,200 years, according to the Weld-Blundell prism and its correlating tablets. For most readers encountering this figure for the first time, the immediate response is dismissal. The numbers are too large to represent individual human lifespans, therefore they must be symbolic. But this interpretation ignores a crucial and profoundly disturbing pattern embedded within those numbers. 241,200 divided by 60, the Sumerian base mathematical unit, yields exactly 4,020, itself a multiple of the SAR cycle. The individual reign lengths, when mapped against Sumerian astronomical calculations for the Great Year, the 25,920-year precessional cycle, reveal precise relationships that could not have been accidentally generated. The reign of Alulim at 28,800 years corresponds to 8 SAR cycles. Alulgar's 36,000 years represents 10 cycles. These are not legends poorly remembered. These are records of something real, expressed in a time measurement system we've not yet learned to properly decode. The precessional connection becomes fully compelling only when the antediluvian numbers are mapped against what modern astronomy has confirmed about the mechanics of Earth's axial wobble. The precession of the equinoxes proceeds at a rate that causes the vernal equinox to shift through one complete cycle of the zodiac in approximately 25,920 years, dividing that cycle into 12 ages of 2,160 years each, corresponding to the 12 zodiacal constellations. The Sumerian base unit of 3,600, the SAR, and the precessional cycle of 25,920 are related by the ratio of 7.2, itself a value that appears with suspicious frequency in Sumerian astronomical texts in contexts associated with long-cycle temporal calculations. The specific reign lengths assigned to individual antediluvian rulers cluster in patterns that correspond to specific fractions of the precessional cycle, as though the antediluvian chronology was designed to encode astronomical observation data within what appeared on its surface to be a royal succession document. This mathematical encoding has been analysed independently by researchers approaching from different disciplinary perspectives, and they have consistently reached the same uncomfortable conclusion. Astronomers Giorgio de Santillana and Hertha von Deschend, in their landmark 1969 study Hamlet's Mill, systematically demonstrated the presence of precessional mathematics in ancient mythological traditions worldwide, identifying the specific numbers 3,600, 4,320, and 25,920, and their multiples as the signature of an ancient astronomical knowledge system preserved across multiple independent cultures. Their analysis identified the Sumerian King List as one of the primary repositories of this encoded knowledge, and their central observation remains unanswered by conventional scholarship to this day. The people who generated the numbers in the King List possessed knowledge of the precessional cycle, a phenomenon requiring a minimum of several centuries of careful, institutionalized astronomical observation to detect. They did not develop this knowledge over the centuries during which the tablets were produced. They inherited it from a tradition already ancient when the first stylus pressed into the first clay. The question of who maintained that tradition and transmitted it to the civilization we can see in the archaeological record is precisely the question that the Sumerian tablets answer most directly and most specifically. The answer is found in a body of documents spread across the collections of multiple major museums, describing 7 named beings whose characteristics, activities, and ultimate fate represent one of the most significant and most persistently ignored bodies of evidence in the entire history of ancient studies, scattered across the cuneiform tablet collections of the British Museum, the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, and the University of Pennsylvania Museum, is a body of texts collectively describing a group of beings the Sumerians called the Apkallu, rendered in Sumerian as Abgal, meaning literally great water beings or great ones of the waters. These 7 figures, each named and assigned a specific king as a contemporary, are consistently described in Mesopotamian literature not as gods in the mythological sense but as instructors. They are the beings who taught. The tablet designated K3657 in the British Museum collection describes the Apkallu as having brought down from heaven the Emi of all crafts, and as having established the foundation of learning before the waters rose. The precision of this language is worth examining carefully. The tablets do not describe the Apkallu as creating human knowledge. They describe them as transmitting it from somewhere else, before a catastrophe that erased what came before. The 7 Apkallu are named consistently across multiple independent tablet traditions, spanning from the early 2nd millennium through the Neo-Assyrian period, a consistency that itself argues against purely mythological invention. In genuine mythology, the specific names and attributes of secondary divine figures tend to vary considerably across regional traditions and time periods. The Apkallu do not vary. The first, Adapa, appears in the King List context as the sage who served the first antediluvian ruler, Alulim at Eridu. The Babylonian priest and historian Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BC and drawing on temple archives that no longer survive in their original form, described the first of these beings, whom he called Wans, in terms so specific and so unusual that they have occupied scholars for 2 centuries. According to Berossus, as preserved by the later historian Apollodorus of Athens, owans had the form of a fish, but possessed a human head beneath the fish head and human feet beneath the fish tail. During the day he conversed with men, giving them insight into letters and sciences and every kind of art, teaching them to construct cities, to found temples, and to compile laws. And Berossus states explicitly, in a passage that no conventional historian has ever satisfactorily explained, that since that time no further instruction has been given. The physical description offered by Berossus for Oan corresponds to the iconographic tradition found on Assyrian palace reliefs from Nineveh and Nimrud that depict the Apkallu as figures wearing fish-head cloaks or garments that gave the impression of a being emerging from a fish body. These carved reliefs, studied in detail by art historian Dominique Collion of the British Museum, appear consistently in ritual and protective contexts, positioned at doorways and in foundation deposits, where their presence was believed to confer protective influence. The Assyrians of the 1st millennium BC, working from traditions that traced back through the Babylonian period to the original Sumerian sources, depicted the Apkallu in a consistent and specific visual form because they believed they were depicting actual beings whose appearance had been recorded and preserved through an unbroken chain of documentary transmission. The name Adapa, assigned to the first and most important of the 7 Apkallu, derives from a Sumerian root that cuneiformist Wilfrid Lambert of the University of Birmingham, in his comprehensive 1992 study of Mesopotamian wisdom literature, translated as he who knows the model of all things, not he who invented all things, not he who imagined all things, he who knows the model that already existed. The first being credited with transmitting civilization to humanity was, according to the etymology of his own name, the carrier of a pre-existing design. The civilization he transmitted was not his creation. It was an implementation of something that had already been determined elsewhere, in a domain the tablets consistently locate as existing above, beyond, or prior to the world that human beings inhabit. The domains in which the 7 Apkallu provided instruction, as documented across the cuneiform corpus in texts, ranging from the early 2nd millennium BC through the late Assyrian period, correspond with extraordinary precision to the domains in which Sumerian civilization appears fully developed in its earliest archaeological record. The Apkallu are credited with establishing the principles of irrigation engineering, the fundamentals of metallurgical practice, the methods of astronomical observation, the procedures for urban planning and temple construction, and the protocols governing legal, administrative, and ritual life. These are precisely the domains in which the earliest Sumerian cities demonstrate sophisticated, fully developed capabilities with no detectable period of gradual acquisition. The Apkallu taught what the archaeology confirms was already known from the very beginning of the urban record. The convergence between what the tablets describe as transmitted knowledge and what the excavations reveal as mysteriously complete knowledge is exact, and the oldest clay in the world insists it did not happen by accident. The examination of what the Apkallu actually transmitted, as opposed to the mythological framework within which that transmission has been conventionally understood, requires close attention to a specific category of cuneiform document that has received far less scholarly focus than its implications warrant. One of the most frequently cited and least carefully examined documents in the study of ancient Mesopotamian civilization is the tablet known as the Sumerian text of Adapa, preserved in fragmentary copies at multiple museum collections, including tablets discovered in the archive at Amarna in Egypt and now held in Berlin. Adapa, identified as the first of the 7 Apkallu advisors, is described in this text with language that has no parallel in the mythological literature of any surrounding culture. He is called he who completed the plans of heaven and earth, a designation that implies not the invention of a cosmological system, but the fulfillment of one already in progress. The technical details embedded in texts describing Adapa's activities include references to mathematical operations, agricultural optimization procedures, and what the tablets term the proper arrangement of cosmic order, a phrase that in the administrative Sumerian context consistently refers to the establishment of governance protocols rather than religious ritual. The first Apkallu was not a god performing miracles. He was an administrator implementing a pre-existing plan. The discovery of Adapa fragments at Amarna in Egypt, specifically in the archive of the pharaoh Akhenaten dating to approximately 1350 BC, represents one of the most geographically significant finds in the history of cuneiform studies. The Amarna archive, excavated by Flinders Petrie in 1891, and subsequently studied in depth by William Moran of Harvard University, whose analysis was published in his 1992 compilation of the Amarna letters, consists primarily of diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian court and various Near Eastern rulers. The presence of a Mesopotamian literary text, the Adapa myth, within an Egyptian royal archive of this period demonstrates that the traditions concerning the Apkallu were not confined to Mesopotamian cultural boundaries. They were being copied, transmitted, and preserved by the most powerful administrative institutions of the ancient world across vast geographical distances. This is the pattern of a document considered important enough to reproduce by civilizations that had access to the full range of their era's literary production and chose, specifically, to preserve this one. The technical content of the Adapa texts, when isolated from the narrative frame in which it is embedded, reads as something between an operational manual and a systems architecture document. The surviving fragments describe Adapa's role in terms that cuneiformist Simo Parpola of the University of Helsinki, whose analysis of Mesopotamian wisdom traditions published in 1993 remains one of the most detailed studies available, identified as functionally equivalent to what a modern systems administrator does when implementing a pre-designed infrastructure. Adapa does not invent the organizational principles he establishes, he applies them. The tablets describing his activities use the Sumerian verb gar, meaning to place or to set in position, rather than the verb dim, which would indicate creation or fabrication. The distinction is linguistically precise and philosophically fundamental. The civilization of the Sumerians was placed. It was not made. The second Apkallu, known as Ioanna Adapa in some textual traditions, and as the Oannas described by Berossus in others, is specifically credited in the cuneiform corpus with the transmission of what the tablets designate the knowledge of construction and the knowledge of the waters. These twin domains, architectural engineering and hydraulic management, appear together in the Apkallu traditions with a consistency that reflects their practical interdependence in the southern Mesopotamian environment. A civilization built on the alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers could not survive without sophisticated water management infrastructure. The canals, levees, drainage systems, and irrigation networks that made the Sumerian agricultural miracle possible required not only technical knowledge, but also institutional organization capable of maintaining these systems across generations. The Apkallu, according to the tablets, provided both, and the physical evidence for what they provided is still visible beneath the oldest mound in the world. The excavations conducted at the site of Eridu in southern Iraq between 1946 and 1949 under the direction of Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd for the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities produced results that remain among the most startling and consistently underreported in the entire history of Mesopotamian archaeology. Beneath the visible remains of what would become one of the greatest temple complexes of the ancient world, the excavators trace 17 distinct building phases, the lowest of which descended to approximately 5000 BC, predating the conventionally recognized emergence of Sumerian civilization by nearly 2000 years. The critical observation, the one that the conventional developmental model of human civilization cannot accommodate, is not simply that these lower levels are old. It is that the earliest building levels already demonstrate sophisticated understanding of architectural proportion, sacred geometry, and hydraulic engineering. There are no primitive precursors at Eridu. The sophistication does not accumulate gradually from crude beginnings. It begins at the bottom, already mature. Safar and Lloyd's excavation report, published by the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities in 1981, following decades of analysis, described the lowest temple structure, designated Temple Level 17, as consisting of a single rectangular room oriented along a northeast to southwest axis, with internal dimensions of 3 meters by 2.5 meters, constructed from carefully shaped mud brick and featuring a raised platform at one end whose proportions, when measured precisely, conform to a ratio of 1 to phi, the golden section, to within 1% accuracy. This is not an approximation. This is not accidental. A single rectangular room built on an alluvial plain in the 5th millennium BC, encoding the golden ratio in its internal proportions with sub-percent precision, is either the product of a mathematical tradition already sophisticated enough to calculate irrational numbers, or it is evidence of transmission from a source that could. No conventional model of 5th millennium BC Mesopotamian cultural development accommodates either possibility comfortably. The successive building levels above Temple Level 17 at Eridu show progressive elaboration of the original plan rather than revision of it. Levels 16 through 12, spanning approximately the 5th and early 4th millennia BC, expand the footprint of the structure, add subsidiary rooms and forecourts, and introduce increasingly sophisticated drainage systems, but they do so according to proportional and orientational principles established in the very first building phase. Later builders were not redesigning, they were extending. This pattern, a series of expansions that preserve the original plan while incrementally elaborating it, is consistent with what happens when a tradition of precise technical knowledge is transmitted intact through successive generations of practitioners. It is not consistent with the gradual experimental development that the conventional model of early civilization demands. The hydraulic features of the Eridu temple complex deserve particular attention because they represent the physical confirmation of what the cuneiform texts describe as the primary technological domain of the deity associated with this site. The lowest and most ancient temple structure at Eridu, identified by excavators as a prototype of what would become the Abzu temple complex dedicated to Enki, the Sumerian lord of wisdom and water, presents a set of engineering achievements that fundamentally challenge the standard narrative of gradual technological development in southern Mesopotamia. The structure incorporates a network of underground channels, water management conduits, and drainage systems that were carved through natural sediment with geometric precision that required both sophisticated surveying instruments and a detailed prior understanding of hydraulic flow dynamics. The cuneiform texts describing Enki's domain consistently associate him with the Abzu. the freshwater body that the Sumerians identified as existing beneath the earth itself, and the engineering at the Eridu site appears to have been designed to maintain direct physical connection with the water table in precisely the manner those texts describe. The engineering calculations required to design and execute these systems at this date, approximately 5000 BC, imply access to mathematical knowledge and observational data that should not have been available to a civilization supposedly still in its earliest stages of agricultural organization. The underground channel system at Eridu was analyzed in detail by the civil engineering consultants brought in to assist the Iraqi Department of Antiquities excavation, whose technical report incorporated into Safar and Lloyd's publication calculated the gradient of the primary drainage conduit at 0.3 degrees of slope across a measured horizontal distance of approximately 18 meters. Maintaining this gradient across that distance through hand-excavated sediment requires either extremely precise measurement instruments or a surveying technique capable of detecting angular deviations smaller than 1 degree across distances measured in tens of meters. Neither capability appears anywhere in the conventional documentation of 5th millennium BC technological achievement. The conduit gradient was not approximated, it was engineered, and the engineering it required was more precise than anything the conventional record says existed at that time. The implications of this hydraulic engineering extend beyond technical capability into questions of purpose. The cuneiform texts from later periods describe the Abzu beneath the Eridu temple as a direct communication interface between the earthly domain and the realm of Enki himself, a conduit not only for water but for knowledge transmitted between terrestrial and non-terrestrial sources. The physical design of the underground channel system, which carries water from the surrounding sediment toward the temple's inner sanctuary, rather than away from it, is consistent with what the texts describe. The Eridu temple was not built to keep water out. It was built to bring specific water in, to maintain direct physical contact with the aquifer beneath, in accordance with a design whose purpose the texts describe explicitly and whose engineering the archaeology confirms in precise physical detail. Understanding what was being transmitted through this infrastructure requires engaging the conceptual framework that the Sumerian tablets themselves provide for what the Apkallu brought from heaven to earth. No concept in ancient Sumerian literature reveals more clearly the nature of what the tablets are actually describing than the me, a Sumerian term that has no clean single-word translation in any modern language because it encompasses something our contemporary vocabulary does not easily accommodate. The me, pronounced approximately may, refers to the fundamental principles and technical protocols governing every aspect of civilized existence, from the construction of cities and the administration of governance to the practice of medicine, the smelting of metals, and the observation of celestial movements. The critical detail embedded in every Sumerian text that references the me is their origin. They did not emerge from human ingenuity. They descended from heaven in the possession of beings who already held them. The text known as Enki and the World Order, preserved in tablets at the University of Pennsylvania Museum and extensively analyzed by Sumerian scholar Samuel Noah Kramer throughout the 1940s and 50s, describes Enki distributing the me to different regions of the earth in a manner indistinguishable from a colonial administrator assigning technological resources to newly established outposts. The specific me listed across various Sumerian texts number well over 100 individual items, and their content reveals the comprehensive scope of what was being transmitted. The list preserved in the text known as Inanna and Enki studied in depth by Kramer and his collaborator Diane Walkstein, whose 1983 analysis remains the standard reference, includes items ranging from the abstract, such as the descent into the underworld and the ascent from it, through the administrative, including the roles of king and priest and the institution of law, to the purely technical, encompassing the crafts of the smith, the carpenter, the leather worker, and the scribe. Most significantly, the list includes what the text designates as the knowledge of the heart, a phrase that Kramer interpreted as referring to the foundational wisdom underlying all the other ME, the theoretical basis from which every specific technical application derives. The ME were not a collection of individual tricks. They were a unified system of knowledge with a coherent theoretical foundation that individual technical disciplines expressed in particular domains. The distribution of the ME in the Enki and the World Order text follows a geographical pattern that corresponds closely to the known distribution of early civilizational development across the ancient Near East and surrounding regions. Enki does not randomly assign knowledge domains. He systematically distributes them across a defined geographical space, assigning specific ME to specific cities and regions in a manner that creates a coordinated, interdependent system of specialized production and governance. Nippur receives the ME of music and religious ceremony. Ur receives the ME of maritime commerce. Meluha, identified by scholars as the Indus Valley region, receives the ME of craft production and tree cultivation. The system described is not mythological, it is organizational. It describes the deliberate establishment of a coordinated economic and administrative network across a region spanning thousands of kilometers, a network whose physical traces are visible in the archaeological record of the 4th and 3rd millennia BC, precisely where the text says they should be. The physical evidence that confirms the tablet traditions extends backward in time, far beyond the emergence of cuneiform writing itself, into periods when the knowledge being distributed was already producing sophisticated results that the conventional developmental model cannot explain. Among the most compelling sites in this earlier evidential record is one that received little scholarly attention until the 1960s, and that continues to be substantially underreported relative to its significance. Located approximately 100 kilometers north of Baghdad near the modern city of Samarra, the archaeological site of Tel Es-Sarwan represents one of the most important and most underappreciated pieces of physical evidence for advanced knowledge existing in Mesopotamia long before the conventionally recognized emergence of Sumerian civilization. Excavations conducted between 1964 and 1968 under the direction of Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar revealed a settlement dating to approximately 6000 BC, predating the earliest known Sumerian cities by over 2,000 years, that displayed architectural planning, irrigation engineering, and decorative artistry of a sophistication entirely inconsistent with its position on the conventional timeline of human development. The pottery recovered from Tel Es-Sarwan, now designated as belonging to the Ubed Cultural Horizon, bears geometric decoration patterns whose analysis by archaeoastronomer Alexander Thom revealed embedded mathematical relationships corresponding to precise astronomical observation data, including accurate calculations of planetary cycles and stellar positions. These were not decorative choices, they were encoded knowledge, preserved in the most durable medium available. Thom's analysis of the Tel Es-Sarwan pottery, conducted in the 1970s and published in a series of papers that received considerably less attention than his contemporaneous work on British megalithic sites, identified specific geometric patterns on the ceramics that encode what he recognized as angular measurements corresponding to the rising and setting positions of Venus at specific points in its synodic cycle. The synodic cycle of Venus, the period of approximately 583 days between successive appearances of the planet at the same position relative to the Sun, produces a series of horizon positions for Venus at maximum elongation that can only be accurately plotted through sustained observations spanning multiple years. The angular values encoded in the Tel Es-Sorwan pottery decorations are not approximations of these positions. They're accurate to within tolerances that Tom calculated as corresponding to less than half a degree of arc, a precision that demands either systematic long-term observational records or access to pre-existing data that had already accumulated over an extended observational program. The architectural planning at Tel Es-Sorwan presents a parallel anomaly. The settlement's buildings, constructed from pressed mud brick and organized according to a regular street grid, demonstrate spatial organization principles whose sophistication the site's position on the developmental timeline does not predict. Safar's excavation report noted the presence of a perimeter wall enclosing the settlement that is oriented within 2 degrees of true north, a precision of cardinal alignment that at this period requires a surveying methodology capable of determining the true meridian through astronomical observation. The wall's foundations incorporate a drainage channel running along its inner face whose gradient, like the drainage systems at Eridu, maintains a consistent slope across its entire measured length to a precision that demands accurate linear measurement instruments. Tel Es-Sorwan is not a primitive Neolithic village that happened to make decorated pottery. It is evidence of a population already working within an established tradition of precise measurement, astronomical knowledge, and architectural organization at a date 2,000 years before the first cuneiform tablet was pressed. The Ubaid cultural horizon to which Tel Es-Sorwan belongs extends across a geographical range that stretches from the Anatolian highlands in the north to the shores of the Persian Gulf in the south and eastward into the Zagros mountain foothills, a distribution spanning over 1,000 kilometers in multiple directions. Sites belonging to this cultural tradition consistently demonstrate the same anomalous combination of characteristics: architectural precision exceeding the expected level for their period, pottery encoding astronomical and mathematical data, and evidence of standardized measurement systems that presuppose a shared metrological tradition operating across enormous distances. The Ubaid horizon is not a collection of similar cultures that happen to develop similar techniques independently. It is evidence of a unified knowledge system distributed across a vast territory, the physical signature of the ME distribution that the later cuneiform texts describe in institutional language. The tradition that produced the oldest tablets of the historical record had been in operation, and leaving physical evidence of that operation for at least 2,000 years before the first clay was pressed with the first reed. The day before history began was not a day, it was a civilization. The evidence accumulated from the oldest Sumerian tablets, the hydraulic engineering beneath the first city, the mathematical encoding in pre-urban Ubaid pottery, and the ME distribution texts collectively established that a sophisticated knowledge tradition was operating in Mesopotamia at least 2,000 years before the first cuneiform record was produced. But the full scope of what existed before the historical record becomes apparent only when the investigation extends beyond Mesopotamia entirely, to a site in southeastern Turkey whose excavation in the 1990s permanently disrupted the foundations of conventional prehistoric archaeology. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began systematic excavation of a hilltop site in southeastern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, and in doing so initiated what has become perhaps the single greatest crisis in the history of conventional archaeology. The site, located approximately 15 kilometers northeast of the city of Sanliurfa, consists of massive circular enclosures formed by T-shaped limestone pillars weighing between 10 and 50 tons each, covered in carved reliefs depicting animals, abstract symbols, and humanoid figures with characteristics that correspond closely to descriptions of the Apkallu in Mesopotamian cuneiform texts. The structures date to approximately 9,600 BC, making them the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth by a margin of 6,000 years. They predate the invention of pottery, the development of agriculture, and the emergence of any known complex social organization according to the conventional model of human development. The deliberate burial of the site around 8000 BC, a fact established through sediment analysis, suggests a conscious decision to preserve it against future discovery, a pattern consistent with the knowledge preservation protocols described in the Sumerian administrative tablets themselves. Schmidt, who devoted the remainder of his professional life to Göbekli Tepe until his death in 2014, estimated in his final published assessment of the site that less than 5% of the total complex had been exposed by excavation. The enclosures so far revealed, designated by the excavation team as enclosures A through H, range in diameter from 10 to 30 meters and contain between 8 and 12 central T-pillars whose height reaches up to 5.5 meters. The two largest central pillars in enclosure D measure 5.5 meters tall and carry bas-relief carvings of arms, hands and a belt with a fox pelt buckle on their shafts, features that Schmidt identified as indicating the pillars represent anthropomorphic beings, entities with humanoid form depicted in stone at monumental scale. These are not abstract symbols, they are portraits of something the builders wanted to document. The carved reliefs covering the pillar surfaces at Göbekli Tepe include representations of specific animal species whose combination and arrangement has been analysed by astronomer and archaeologist Giulio Magli of the Politecnico di Milano, whose 2016 study identified the animal groupings as corresponding to specific constellations in the position they occupied in the night sky during the construction period. The vulture depicted on Pillar 43 in enclosure D, carrying what appears to be a sphere in its wing, corresponds in Magli's analysis to the constellation Sagittarius at the position of the galactic centre during the epoch of construction. The scorpion depicted beneath the vulture corresponds to the constellation Scorpius at the same epoch. This is not decorative carving. It is a dated astronomical record, carved in stone on a pillar weighing 50 tons, at a site that by conventional archaeological standards should have been occupied by scattered bands of pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers who had not yet developed the organizational capacity to fire pottery. The logistical requirements for constructing Göbekli Tepe present a challenge to conventional models of Neolithic social organization that no published response has satisfactorily resolved. The limestone pillars were quarried from bedrock outcrops located approximately 500 meters from the construction site, a distance that under favorable conditions would require several hundred workers equipped with rope and wooden sledges to transport a single 50-ton block. Archaeologist Edward Swenson of the University of Toronto, writing in a 2012 analysis of Neolithic monumental construction, calculated that maintaining a workforce sufficient to quarry, transport, shape, and erect the pillars at the rate the stratigraphic evidence suggests would require a permanent or semi-permanent labour force of at minimum several hundred individuals, supported by a food production and distribution system of considerable organisational sophistication. a food production and distribution system in 9600 BC implies agriculture. Agriculture, at that date and in that location, implies a developmental sequence that the conventional model has not produced evidence for. Göbekli Tepe should not exist. Its existence is the most important fact in prehistoric archaeology, and its connection to the traditions preserved in the Sumerian tablets becomes unmistakable the moment one examines the iconography on its pillars alongside the cuneiform descriptions of the beings who established civilization. The humanoid figures on the Göbekli Tepe pillars, their arms rendered in shallow relief along the pillar shafts with hands positioned at the front in a posture identical to that shown in Assyrian palace carvings of the Apkallu from 6,000 years later, raise a question that neither conventional archaeology nor conventional mythology can answer on their own terms. The same beings, depicted in the same posture, appear in the artistic record at the beginning and at a point 6,000 years into the middle of the known human civilizational sequence. What connects those two endpoints is precisely what the Sumerian tablets describe. And the words those tablets use to describe these beings, examined with the precision they deserve, are more specific than any translation available in mainstream scholarship suggests. The terminology the Sumerians used to designate the beings described in their oldest tablets reveals, through careful linguistic analysis, a conceptual framework that differs fundamentally from the religious mythology with which it is typically classified. The Sumerian term Anunnaki, which appears in the earliest cuneiform writing and is consistently translated in academic literature as something approximating those of noble blood or princes of heaven, carries in its root components a far more precise and more disturbing meaning, and means heaven or sky. NA is a marker of descent or coming from. K means earth. The Anunnaki are, in the most literal possible translation of the component morphemes, those who came from the sky to the earth. This is not metaphor. This is the terminological choice of a civilization that was describing something that had actually occurred. Further linguistic analysis conducted by Sumerologist Thorkild Jacobsen of Harvard University, across decades of research into the earliest Sumerian literary corpus, consistently showed that the terminology for these beings employs the administrative vocabulary of governance and physical presence, rather than the reverent abstraction of religious devotion. Jacobsen's landmark 1976 synthesis of Mesopotamian religious history, published under the title The Treasures of Darkness, established that the Sumerian conceptual vocabulary for divine beings does not begin with the category of deity as modern readers understand it. The earliest attestations of the terms used for the Anunnaki in Proto-Cuneiform writing do not appear in contexts associated with prayer, supplication, or religious ceremony. They appear in administrative inventories, labor allocation records, and territorial boundary documents. These are the contexts in which, at the very earliest recoverable phase of the written record, the Anunnaki are mentioned. They are mentioned alongside grain allocations, canal maintenance schedules, and lists of city officials. The oldest written references to the Anunnaki are not hymns, they're organizational records. They describe beings who held administrative roles, managed resources, and oversaw territorial domains with the same practical specificity with which Sumerian tablets describe the duties of a city governor. The distinction between An and Ki, heaven and earth, in the Sumerian cosmological vocabulary is not a spiritual abstraction, but a spatial description. Sumerologist Bent Alster of the University of Copenhagen, whose extensive analysis of Sumerian literary geography was published across multiple studies between 1972 and 2005, demonstrated that AN and KI in the earliest texts consistently designate physical locations rather than spiritual conditions. AN refers to a region above the earth, from which specific beings originated and to which they could return. KI refers to the terrestrial domain in which those beings operated during the period of their presence. The Anunnaki are not a mythological concept describing the relationship between the human and the divine. They are a geographical designation describing beings whose origin was above the earth and whose activities occurred upon it. The terminology for the secondary class of divine beings, the Igigi, provides additional evidence for this interpretation. The Akkadian term Igigi, used in Babylonian texts as the designator for the class of divine beings who served under the primary Anunnaki leadership, derives from a root that Assyriologist Wolfram von Soden's comprehensive Akkadian dictionary, published between 1959 and 1981, traces to a verbal form meaning to see repeatedly or to observe continuously. The Igigi are, in the most etymologically precise translation available, those who watch continuously. They are observers. The administrative vocabulary for the beings who arrive from the sky describes one class as governors, the Anunnaki, and another as surveillance personnel, the Igigi. These are the terminological categories of an organizational hierarchy, not a theological system. The civilization that preserved these words in its oldest texts was describing a governance structure with a precision that only makes sense if that structure was at some point directly observed. The astronomical knowledge preserved in the cuneiform corpus provides perhaps the most technically demanding evidence that the traditions recorded in these tablets derive from a source with capabilities exceeding anything the historical Mesopotamian civilizations could have independently produced. Among the cuneiform tablets recovered from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh and now held in the British Museum collection is a comprehensive astronomical compendium designated Emul Apin, a text that has been dated in its preserved form to approximately 700 BC, but which internal astronomical analysis consistently places in its observational origins at approximately 1700 BC or earlier. The significance of Mulapin extends far beyond its catalogue of star names and stellar positions. The document records observations of planetary movements, lunar cycles, and stellar risings with a mathematical precision that, as demonstrated by the analysis of historian of science Otto Neugebauer, required a continuous institutionalized observational program spanning a minimum of several centuries to accumulate. The precession of the equinoxes, the 25,920-year cycle, caused by Earth's axial wobble, is encoded in the mathematical relationships between the stellar position data recorded in Emul Apin, with an accuracy that the tablet's supposed composers could not have achieved through the observational technology available to them. They were working from records far older than themselves. Neugebauer's foundational analysis of Babylonian mathematical astronomy, published in his 1955 work, The Exact Sciences in Antiquity, and expanded in his monumental 3-volume study, Mathematical Astronomical Cuneiform Texts of 1975, demonstrated that the predictive capabilities of Babylonian astronomy substantially exceed what the observational instruments available to ancient astronomers should have permitted. Naked eye observation of planetary positions conducted without mechanical aids for angle measurement or timing instruments of sufficient precision produces positional data accurate to approximately half a degree of arc under the most favorable conditions. The predictive tables contained in the cuneiform astronomical corpus, including the lunar tables that enable eclipse prediction, accurate to within minutes across periods of centuries, require input data precise to a small fraction of that value. the Babylonian astronomers were not working from the observations they could have made. They were working from a database that was more precise than their instruments permitted, which means they were working from a database they had inherited rather than generated. The Saros cycle, the 18-year period of approximately 223 synodic months, after which lunar and solar eclipses repeat with closely similar geometry, is embedded in the Mul-Apin tables with accuracy that requires knowledge of the precise period of the moon's nodal regression. Calculating the nodal regression to sufficient precision demands a continuous observational record spanning at minimum several complete Saros cycles, meaning at minimum 54 years of uninterrupted and metrologically consistent lunar observation before the cycle can even be identified, let alone calculated to the precision the cuneiform tables reflect. The institutional structure required to maintain such an observational program across 3 generations of astronomers, preserving records with consistent measurement standards and sufficient documentation for the next generation to use, implies a level of scientific organization that the conventional model of ancient Mesopotamia places several centuries later than the evidence requires. The Venus tablets of Ammisaduqa, preserved in copies ultimately derived from observations made during the reign of the Babylonian king Ammisaduqa in the first half of the 2nd millennium BC, and analyzed in detail by astronomer Peter Huber of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in his 1982 study, record the rising and setting times of Venus over a 21-year period, with positional accuracy that Huber calculated as requiring not only consistent observation, but also mathematical correction procedures to account for atmospheric refraction effects near the horizon. Atmospheric refraction, the bending of light as it passes through the Earth's atmosphere, causes celestial objects to appear slightly higher above the horizon than their true geometric positions. Correcting for this effect requires understanding of the phenomenon and a mathematical model for its magnitude, knowledge that was not formally described in European scientific literature until the 17th century. The Venus tablets of Ammisaduqa incorporate corrections whose values match the actual magnitude of atmospheric refraction at the latitude of Babylon. The ancient astronomers were correcting for an effect that, according to the conventional history of science, they should not have known existed. The specific domain of technical knowledge that most directly connects the astronomical capabilities preserved in the cuneiform corpus to the flood traditions that form the central narrative of the oldest Sumerian records is the capacity for long-range planning against catastrophic environmental disruption. The astronomical evidence indicates that whoever generated the observational data underlying the cuneiform tables possessed the capability to predict major celestial events across timescales measured in decades and centuries. That same predictive capability applied to the flood cycles that geological and archaeological evidence confirms were a recurring feature of the southern Mesopotamian environment would have enabled advanced preparation for catastrophic inundation on a scale that the Eridu Genesis fragment describes in the administrative language of prepared emergency protocols. The flood was not a surprise to those who saw it coming. The tablets are explicit on this point, and the technical capabilities the astronomy implies confirm that they had reason to be. The 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, discovered by assistant keeper of Oriental Antiquities George Smith at the British Museum in 1872, among the cuneiform tablets recovered from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh, produced a sensation in the Victorian scholarly world because it appeared to confirm the biblical account of Noah's flood in pre-biblical form. What was not appreciated at the time, and has still not been fully absorbed by mainstream scholarship, is that the flood account contained in the Gilgamesh tablets and its Sumerian precursor, The Ziusudra fragment from Nippur is not structured like a religious narrative at all. It is structured like a technical report. The instructions transmitted to the flood survivor include specific vessel dimensions, expressed in precise mathematical ratios, explicit material specifications for waterproofing compounds, including the application of bitumen in calculated layers, compartmentalization schemes for cargo and passenger separation, and loading procedures that demonstrate practical knowledge of weight distribution and vessel stability. These are not the details of a god performing a miracle. These are the details of an engineer implementing a prepared emergency protocol. The vessel dimensions specified in the Gilgamesh flood tablet are among the most analyzed numbers in the entire ancient Near Eastern textual corpus, and the controversy surrounding them consistently obscures a straightforward observation. The tablet specifies that Utnapishtim's vessel was constructed with equal length, width, and depth, creating a cubic or approximately cubic form with interior dimensions measured in units of the standard Babylonian cubit of approximately 50 centimeters. The specified dimensions produce a vessel with an interior volume of approximately 40,000 cubic meters by the calculation of naval architect and ancient ship historian Irving Finkel of the British Museum, who published his detailed analysis in 2014. Finkel further demonstrated that the specific ratios given for the vessel's wall thickness relative to its interior dimensions correspond to structural engineering principles for maximum load-bearing capacity under hydrostatic pressure, the pressure exerted by surrounding water on a submerged or partially submerged hull. The ancient flood vessel was not designed by intuition. Its structural parameters were calculated against the physical forces it would encounter. The engineer who specified those parameters understood those forces in mathematical terms. The waterproofing specifications in the Gilgamesh tablet are equally precise and equally revealing. The text specifies the application of bitumen to the vessel's hull in a sequence that modern materials engineers recognize as describing a layered composite sealing system. A primary layer of bitumen applied to the exterior surface provides the initial waterproof barrier. A secondary application of pitch to the interior surface provides redundancy against any breach in the primary layer. The junction between hull planking and structural frames receives a separate treatment of what the text describes as a lubricating compound, corresponding to the modern engineering practice of sealing structural joints with flexible, rather than rigid sealant to accommodate the differential movement between structural members under load. These specifications are not generic instructions for making something waterproof. They are a calibrated engineering protocol for constructing a survival vessel, capable of maintaining structural integrity under the conditions produced by a major flood event. The person who wrote these specifications had either designed such a vessel before, or was working from technical documentation produced by someone who had. The Sumerian flood narrative, preserved in the tablet designated CBS 10,673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and identified as the Eridu Genesis fragment by Samuel Noah Kramer, predates the Gilgamesh version by at least 5 centuries and differs from it in ways that become deeply significant when examined carefully. Where the Gilgamesh version presents the flood as a somewhat spontaneous decision by the Divine Council, the Sumerian original describes it in language that consistently suggests advanced planning, prepared infrastructure, and deliberate outcome management. The tablet fragment describes how the god Enki instructed Ziusudra not only in the construction of his vessel, but also in the preservation of what the text calls the seed of all living things and the ME that governed civilization. The phrase used for this preservation effort in the archaic Sumerian employs the same administrative vocabulary found in texts describing the deliberate archiving of important documents before a known crisis. This was not a rescue mounted in response to an unexpected catastrophe. This was a backup protocol activated according to a prepared schedule. The specific Sumerian terminology used in the CBS 10,673 tablet to describe Enki's instructions to Ziusudra has been the subject of detailed philological analysis by Sumerologist Miguel Civil of the Oriental Institute of Chicago, whose unpublished working notes on the Eridu Genesis fragments were made available to subsequent researchers, including Kramer himself. Civil's analysis identified the verb form used for Enki's act of instruction as the Sumerian causative construction, a grammatical form that in administrative texts consistently indicates not spontaneous action, but the execution of a previously authorized directive. Enki does not decide to warn Ziusudra. He executes the warning function of a pre-existing plan. The causative construction in this context is the grammatical signature of institutional authority, acting through established procedure rather than individual initiative responding to emergency. The flood plan existed before the flood. The individual executing it was implementing, not improvising. The content of what Enki instructs Ziusudra to preserve provides the clearest statement anywhere in the Sumerian textual corpus of what was considered most essential to the continuity of civilization across a catastrophic event. The text specifies 3 categories of preserved material: the seed of all living things, designating biological material necessary for restoring the ecosystem, the craft knowledge necessary for rebuilding agricultural and material production, and the ME themselves, the fundamental governance and technical protocols that constituted the operational foundation of civilized organization. This is a categorized backup inventory. Category 1, biological. Category 2, technical. Category 3, institutional. The preservation effort was not conceived as saving lives. It was conceived as preserving the complete operational specification of a civilization in sufficient detail that what emerged from the flood would not need to reinvent what had existed before it. The day after the flood began, according to the oldest tablet that describes it, was already planned. The question the evidence forces us to ask is how far in advance that planning was done, and by whom. The institutional planning revealed by the Sumerian flood traditions, the categorized preservation protocols, the advanced vessel construction, and the deliberate archiving of the ME point toward a governance structure operating on timescales far exceeding anything that can be accommodated within the conventional framework of ancient Mesopotamian religion. That same governance structure, described in the Cuneiform corpus with administrative precision, does not appear in isolation. Across the full width of the ancient world, separated by geography and by language, but united by the consistency of what they record, independent civilizational traditions preserve accounts of the same events, the same beings, and the same institutional arrangements, described in the same non-mythological register. Nowhere is this parallel more precisely documented than in the oldest surviving records of Egyptian royal history, where a papyrus that conventional scholarship has spent 2 centuries misclassifying presents evidence that demands to be read on its own terms. The Sumerian King List, a papyrus document discovered by Italian explorer Bernardino Drovetti in 1822 and now preserved in the Museo Egizio in Turin, presents Egyptology with the same fundamental challenge that the Sumerian King List presents to Assyriology, and the scholarly response in both cases has been virtually identical: dismissal through reclassification as mythology. The Turin Papyrus records a sequence of rulers who governed Egypt before the first human dynasties, beginning with a period of divine kingship in which figures such as Ptah, Ra, Shu, Geb, Osiris, Seth, and Horus are credited with reigns measured in thousands of years. The papyrus then records a transitional period governed by what it calls the followers of Horus, before the first conventional pharaohs appear. This sequence corresponds precisely to what Egyptian temple inscriptions at Edfu, dated to the Ptolemaic period but explicitly described as copies of far older texts, call the Zep Tepi the first time when divine beings from the sky established the foundations of Egyptian civilization following a great catastrophe that destroyed the previous world. The Turin Papyrus was purchased by Drovetti during his tenure as French consul general in Egypt, and subsequently acquired by the King of Sardinia, whose collection was donated to form the basis of the Museo Egizio. The document reached Turin in a severely fragmented state, broken into over 160 pieces during transit, and the reconstruction of the text occupied Egyptologists across the 19th and 20th centuries. The most complete modern reconstruction was published by Alan Gardner of Oxford University in 1959, and Gardner's analysis established that the papyrus, in its intact form, contained a comprehensive list of Egyptian rulers from the divine period through the historical dynasties, with reign lengths, capital cities, and succession sequences that in the historical sections correspond closely to information preserved in other Egyptian royal records. The historical sections of the Turin Papyrus are accurate. They contain verifiable information cross-referenced against other sources. This accuracy in the historical sections provides no basis for dismissing the pre-dynastic sections as mythology, rather than treating them with the same presumption of accuracy applied to the sections we can verify. The divine rulers listed in the earliest portion of the Turin Papyrus are not described in the language of religious narrative. They are listed with reign lengths expressed in precise numerical values, capital cities identified by name, and succession sequences that follow the same formal structure used for human rulers in the historical sections. Ptah is credited with a reign of an unrecoverable duration due to papyrus damage. Ra's reign is preserved as encompassing a specific numerical period. The succession through Shu, Geb, Osiris, Seth, and Horus follows a lineage pattern that, when compared to the Heliopolitan cosmological texts analysed by Egyptologist John Baines of Oxford University in his 1991 study of Egyptian cosmogony, reflects not an invented mythological genealogy, but what Baines identified as a system of institutional succession in which specific domains of authority were transferred between designated figures according to established protocols. The Turin Papyrus is not recording who the Egyptians worshipped, it is recording who governed Egypt before the pharaohs did. The Edfu building texts carved into the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu during the Ptolemaic period, but explicitly attributed in their own preamble to ancient manuscripts preserved from the time of the followers of Horus, provide detailed additional information about the Zep Tepi period that supplements the Turin Papyrus record. Egyptologist Eve Raymond of the University of Manchester, whose 1969 analysis of the Edfu texts remains the most comprehensive scholarly treatment available, identified within those inscriptions a specific narrative describing the arrival of divine beings identified as the Shebti or builder gods, who descended onto a primordial island following a catastrophe that had destroyed the previous world. These beings then established the first sacred structures according to a plan that the texts describe as deriving from a document called the Writings of the Ancestors, a prior architectural specification that the builder gods were implementing rather than inventing. The pattern is identical to what the Sumerian texts describe. Beings who arrived, beings who built according to a pre-existing plan, beings whose work constituted a recovery rather than a beginning. The cross-cultural consistency of this governance pattern, established through administrative precision in both Egyptian and Sumerian records, extends further still when the Jewish textual tradition is examined on its own terms, rather than through the lens of later theological interpretation. What emerges from that examination is not a religious parallel but a documentary one, and the precision of its correspondence to the Mesopotamian sources is more specific than any theory of cultural borrowing can comfortably account for. The Book of Enoch, a Jewish text preserved most completely in the Ethiopic language through the Kebra Nagas tradition, and in fragmentary Aramaic form among the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered at Qumran between 1947 and 1956, describes a group of 200 celestial beings called Watchers, who descended to Earth during the Antediluvian period and taught forbidden knowledge to humanity. The correspondences between the Watchers described in this text and the Apkallu described in Mesopotamian cuneiform sources are not merely thematic. They are precise, specific, and extend to details that could not have been derived from general cultural diffusion. The specific number of 200 descending beings corresponds to administrative records from Nippur that enumerate exactly 200 Agigi, the lesser divine beings who served under the primary Anunnaki leadership. The specific domains of knowledge attributed to individual Watcher leaders in the Enochic tradition, including Azazel's instruction in metallurgy and Barachel's teaching of astronomical observation, correspond point for point with the domains assigned to individual Apkallu advisors in cuneiform administrative texts. The Aramaic fragments of the Book of Enoch recovered from Cave 4 at Qumran, published in their critical edition by Joseph Milik of the École Biblique in Jerusalem in his 1976 study, have been dated by paleographic analysis to the 2nd century BC, making them among the oldest surviving textual witnesses to the Enochic tradition. What Milik's analysis established, and what subsequent scholars including George Nicholsberg of the University of Iowa in his 2001 commentary on 1st Enoch confirmed, is that the Qumran fragments do not represent the composition of the Enochic traditions but their transmission. The traditions themselves are demonstrably older than the manuscripts that preserve them, drawing on sources whose characteristics indicate Mesopotamian derivation. The specific geographical setting assigned to the Watcher descent in the Enochic text, Mount Hermon located at the northern boundary of the ancient Levant, corresponds to what Mesopotamian administrative texts designate as the northern boundary of the Anunnaki territorial domain, the region where tablets from the Kassite period describe ongoing non-human presence as late as the 2nd millennium BC. The individual Watcher leaders named in the Enochic tradition carry designations whose etymological analysis reveals Mesopotamian rather than Hebrew linguistic origins. The name Shemihaza, given as the chief Watcher, derives from roots meaning the name sees or the Watcher of the name, a designation that corresponds precisely to the administrative title given to the leading Apkallu in Babylonian texts, where the primary sage is described as the one who perceives the proper arrangements. Azazel, credited in the Enochic text specifically with teaching humanity the working of metals and the cutting of roots for medicinal compounds, corresponds in his assigned domains to the 2nd and 5th Apkallu of the cuneiform tradition, Wana Adapa and Enmebuluga, who are credited respectively with metallurgical instruction and pharmaceutical knowledge. These are not thematic resemblances. They are specific correspondences in specific knowledge domains assigned to specifically named individuals, preserved in documents produced by cultures separated by geography and by the absence of any documented direct textual contact at the period when these traditions were first recorded. The statistical improbability of this correspondence occurring through independent development is compounded when the numerical data embedded in both traditions is examined, because the numbers in the Sumerian King List and throughout the broader Cuneiform astronomical corpus constitute perhaps the single most powerful argument against coincidental parallel development that the entire body of ancient evidence contains. The antediluvian reign lengths recorded in the Sumerian King List have been subjected, since the discovery of the Weld-Blundell prism, to extensive mathematical analysis by scholars including Thorkild Jacobsen, whose 1939 study of the document remains foundational, and more recently by mathematicians including Friedhelm Rochberg, whose work on Babylonian astronomical mathematics has illuminated the numerical systems underlying these ancient records. The conclusion that emerges from this analysis is not comfortable for conventional interpretations. The 8 reign lengths recorded for pre-flood rulers, totaling 241,200 years, are not merely large numbers, they are mathematically encoded. Every single value is a multiple of 3,600, the Sumerian SAR. The specific multiples used correspond to known astronomical cycles, including the synodic periods of Jupiter and Saturn and the 18-year Saros eclipse cycle. The probability that 8 independently assigned mythological numbers would all coincidentally be exact multiples of the same base unit and simultaneously encode meaningful astronomical values is, according to statistical analysis, effectively 0. These numbers were calculated, not invented. Rochberg's analysis, most comprehensively presented in her 2004 study The Heavenly Writing, demonstrated through detailed examination of the Babylonian astronomical corpus that the mathematical relationships embedded in the cuneiform numerical traditions are not isolated to the King List, but pervade the entire body of Mesopotamian technical literature. The synodic period of Jupiter, the time between successive oppositions of the planet as observed from Earth, is approximately 398.9 days, yielding a value over 36 years of approximately 4,328 days, within 1% of the Sumerian value of 4,320, which equals exactly 6 SAR divided by 30. The synodic period of Saturn, approximately 378.1 days, yields over 60 Saturn cycles, a total of approximately 22,680 days, within 0.5% of the Sumerian value of 21,600, which equals exactly 6 SR. The Saros eclipse cycle of 223 synodic months approximates to 6,585 days, within 1% of 1.83 SAR. These relationships are not approximations that happen to be close to SAR multiples. They are precise encodings of actual astronomical periods expressed in a number system whose base unit was chosen specifically because it generates clean relationships with the major cycles of the solar system. The probability calculation for this correspondence is straightforward and devastating for conventional interpretations. The chance that any random large number will be an exact multiple of 3,600 is approximately 1 in 3,600. The probability that 8 independently generated numbers will all be exact SAR multiples is 1 in 3,600, raised to the 8th power, a number so large that expressing it meaningfully requires scientific notation. That probability is effectively 0. The antediluvian reign lengths are not mythology that happens to be numerically convenient. They are an astronomical encoding system whose designers understood the periodicities of the solar system with a precision that modern computational astronomy has confirmed, and that no ancient civilization, by any conventional model of prehistoric human capability, should have possessed. The full scope of what this mathematical precision implies becomes clear only when the physical infrastructure of the civilization that generated these numbers is examined in the archaeological record, an examination that repeatedly confronts the same pattern seen at Eridu, at Göbekli Tepe, and at Tel Es-Sawan. Sophisticated capabilities appearing fully formed at dates when the conventional model predicts only primitive organization. The conventional model of human civilizational development relies upon a smooth gradient from simple to complex, from crude to sophisticated, from hunter-gatherer organization to urban complexity over a period of thousands of years. The physical evidence extracted from sites throughout the ancient Near East, Anatolia, and the Persian Gulf region consistently refuses to conform to this gradient. At Jericho, occupation layers dating to approximately 9,500 BC reveal a walled settlement with a massive stone tower standing 8.5 meters tall, requiring organized labor of a scale that should not have existed at this point on the developmental timeline. At Catalogued in modern Turkey, a settlement dating to approximately 7,500 BC displays urban planning, specialized artisanal production, and sophisticated symbolic artwork whose complexity implies a level of social organization centuries ahead of any conventional developmental schedule. At the bottom of the Persian Gulf, remote sensing surveys conducted by geologist Geoffrey Rose between 2000 and 2011 identified extensive former land surfaces that were exposed during the last glacial maximum when sea level stood approximately 120 meters lower than today, surfaces that would have constituted the most fertile and well-watered territory in the ancient Near East. The Jericho Tower, excavated by Kathleen Kenyon of the University of London in a series of campaigns between 1952 and 1958, and published in her 1960 study of the site, stands as one of the most persistent anomalies in the Neolithic archaeological record. The tower measures 8.5 meters in preserved height, 9 meters in diameter at the base, and was constructed from undressed limestone blocks fitted without mortar in a technique that requires prior knowledge of stable dry stone construction geometries. The interior contains a staircase of 22 steps carved from the bedrock, providing access from the base to the summit, a feature whose construction requires prior planning of the complete structure before any building begins, since the staircase must be integrated into the tower from the foundation upward. Kenyon's analysis established that the tower predates the invention of pottery by at least 1,000 years, and predates any known agricultural settlement in the Jordan Valley by several centuries, creating a situation in which the most sophisticated piece of construction in the known prehistoric world was built by people who, according to conventional developmental models, had not yet achieved the organizational complexity required to build it. At the base of the Persian Gulf, the surveys conducted by Rose and his colleagues identified geomorphological evidence for a river delta system significantly larger than any currently existing in the region, fed by the combined drainage of the Tigris, Euphrates, Karun, and Wadi Betin rivers during the period of low sea levels. Rose's analysis, published in 2010 in the journal Current Anthropology, calculated that the exposed Gulf basin during the last glacial maximum would have comprised approximately 200,000 square kilometers of exceptionally fertile, well-watered territory at latitudes producing a climate substantially warmer and more productive than the surrounding regions. This is the territory that the rising sea levels of the post-glacial period begin in approximately 14,000 BC and accelerating dramatically between 8,000 and 6,000 BC, progressively inundated over the course of several millennia. The populations inhabiting this region when the inundation began, whose material culture, whose knowledge systems, and whose institutional organization were suddenly and catastrophically displaced by rising waters, are the populations whose traditions most plausibly generated the flood accounts preserved in the Sumerian tablets. They were not describing a myth, they were describing their own history. The populations that emerged from this catastrophic displacement and eventually generated the urban civilizations of the historical record did not arrive in the archaeological record empty-handed. The evidence for what they brought with them, and what may have been added to their biological heritage during the critical transition period, has only recently become accessible through the application of genomic analysis to ancient human remains. And what that analysis reveals challenges the conventional story of human biological development with the same force that the archaeological evidence challenges the conventional story of human cultural development. The application of ancient DNA analysis to archaeological remains from Mesopotamia, the Levant, and surrounding regions has produced results that mainstream genetics has been slow to integrate into existing models of human population history. A landmark study published in 2017 by the Ancient DNA Laboratory at Harvard Medical School, led by David Reich, analyzed genome-wide data from individuals buried at sites spanning the Neolithic and early Bronze Age periods across the Fertile Crescent. Among the findings was a striking discontinuity in the genetic profile of populations at the transition between the pre-urban and early urban periods, a discontinuity that does not correspond to any identified migration event, natural selection pressure, or population replacement scenario in the conventional archaeological record. Certain genetic markers appearing abruptly in populations associated with the earlier Sumerian urban centers, including enhanced variants of genes associated with cognitive processing speed and working memory capacity, show patterns of introduction that genetic modeling places outside normal evolutionary timescales. When these findings are examined alongside cuneiform texts explicitly describing the modification of human biological material by Anunnaki beings as part of the creation of an administrative workforce, the correlation becomes difficult to attribute to coincidence. Reich's 2017 study, published in the journal Nature under the title Genomic History of Ancient Europe, and its companion analyses focusing specifically on Near Eastern populations, utilize shotgun sequencing of ancient DNA recovered from skeletal remains at over 100 archaeological sites across the region, producing the most comprehensive genomic dataset for prehistoric populations then available. The discontinuity identified in Mesopotamian populations at the late Neolithic to early urban transition appears as a statistically significant shift in the frequency of specific allele variants within populations that the archaeological record identifies as continuous, meaning populations occupying the same sites with the same material culture before and after the genomic shift. In population genetics, this pattern, a statistically significant change in allele frequencies within a continuous population without evidence of replacement or admixture from an identified external source, is termed an unexplained bottleneck event. The term is accurate but incomplete. It describes what is observed without explaining what caused it. The Atrahasis epic, the Babylonian version of the Sumerian creation narrative preserved in multiple tablet copies dating from approximately 1700 BC, describes the creation of humanity in terms that, when examined through the lens of modern genomics, read as a description of directed genetic modification rather than divine magical action. The text describes the mixing of divine essence, specifically described as the blood or life force of a sacrificed divine being, with earthly clay specifically described as the fertile soil mixed with water in a process overseen by the goddess Nintu working under Enki's direction, to produce beings with enhanced cognitive capabilities specifically designed to fulfill administrative and labor functions within the Anunnaki operational structure. The document specifies that 14 individual beings were created in the initial series, 7 males and 7 females, each formed from a separate preparation of the combined material. This is not a description of magical divine creation. It is a description, in the conceptual vocabulary available to a Bronze Age scribal tradition, of a biotechnological procedure producing a defined number of test subjects from a standardized protocol. The genomic discontinuity identified by Reich's team at the transition to urban civilization in Mesopotamia occurs at precisely the chronological horizon that the Cuneiform texts identify as the period of Anunnaki operational activity on Earth. The correlation does not prove causation, but it does demand explanation, and no explanation that conventional population genetics has so far offered accounts for all the observed features of the data. The genomic evidence for biological discontinuity at the threshold of the first urban civilizations raises a question that transcends population genetics and returns directly to the oldest tablets and what they describe. If the capabilities that enable the sudden appearance of sophisticated urban organization at the beginning of the Sumerian historical record were in some measure transmitted rather than evolved, then the institutions established to preserve and continue that transmission after the period of direct contact ended become critically important historical phenomena. The cuneiform corpus does not leave this question unanswered. In what may be its most technically remarkable category of documents, the tablets describe with precise architectural and procedural specifications exactly how that preservation was accomplished, and modern archaeology has gone into the ground and confirmed what those specifications describe. Among the most remarkable aspects of the Sumerian cuneiform corpus is the existence of tablets that explicitly describe the creation of underground archive systems designed to preserve knowledge against future catastrophe. The tablet designated N456 in the Nipper collection of the University of Pennsylvania Museum provides construction specifications for what it describes as houses of sealed wisdom beneath major temple complexes throughout southern Mesopotamia. The document specifies chamber depths of 42 cubits below the temple foundation, internal dimensions calculated to house thousands of tablets and larger artifacts, and construction techniques including fired brick sealed with bitumen and rare mineral compounds that the text describes as creating waterproof barriers capable of withstanding extended periods of groundwater infiltration. Archaeological investigation of the Nipper site conducted by the Oriental Institute of Chicago in 1956 confirmed the existence of underground complexes beneath the Ika temple precinct, whose structural characteristics match the tablet specifications with unsettling precision, including the evidence of environmental control systems maintaining air circulation without external openings, a technological achievement that the period's known engineering capabilities cannot account for. The cubit measurement used in tablet N456 corresponds to the Royal Mesopotamian cubit of approximately 53 centimeters, placing the specified chamber depth at approximately 22 meters below the temple foundation level, a depth that at the Nipper site descends well below the water table under current conditions. The construction technique described in the tablet to address this engineering problem involves a composite wall system in which an outer layer of fired brick provides structural support, while an inner face of a compound described as blackened mineral paste, consistent in its described properties with a mixture of bitumen, powdered obsidian, and cedar resin, provides the waterproof barrier. This composite approach to underground waterproofing, alternating structural and sealing layers in a system analogous to modern tanked basement construction, requires prior knowledge of the differential behavior of structural and waterproofing materials under hydrostatic pressure. The specifications are not experimental. They describe a proven system whose design parameters have been optimized through prior experience with the engineering problem it addresses. The environmental control systems identified within the exposed underground chambers at Nippur by the Oriental Institute team, led during the 1956 season by geologist and structural analyst Carl Kraling, were described in the expedition's technical report as a network of interconnected channels and chambers that created a passive air circulation system operating without external openings. The system's function, as Kraling's analysis established, depended on the thermal differential between the underground chamber temperature and the temperature of a deeper shaft system connected to the water table, a differential that drives a continuous convective air flow through the storage spaces without requiring any mechanical assistance or any opening to the surface atmosphere. The engineering principle is identical to that employed in modern passive ventilation systems for underground installations, a principle that was not formally described in European engineering literature until the late 19th century. The ancient builders of the Nippur archive chambers understood passive convective ventilation and designed a system that implemented it with sufficient precision to maintain functional air circulation across the millennia that separated their construction from the modern team that found it still operating. The tablets that describe these underground archive systems provide additional detail about their contents that extends well beyond simple text storage. The document designated VAT 18,934 in the Vorderasiatisches Museum Berlin collection, part of a series of administrative texts dealing with what the tablets term the sealed places of the E-Cure complex, describes the underground chambers at Nippur as containing not only written tablets, but three-dimensional models, mechanical devices, and what the text designates as preserved examples of divine craftsmanship. The phrase used for the mechanical devices employs the Sumerian term for objects that move of themselves, a designation that in other cuneiform contexts refers to mechanical automata or devices with moving components, while the phrase translated as preserved examples uses the same archival vocabulary found in texts describing the preservation of biological specimens in the Uruk Medical Archive. The underground repositories were not libraries in the modern sense. They were complete knowledge repositories preserving textual, mechanical, and biological documentation of a technological tradition whose origins the tablets identify as predating the oldest human civilizations. The institutions established to maintain access to these repositories and to transmit their contents across successive generations of human practitioners represent one of the longest-running and most consequential educational traditions in human history, a tradition whose traces are visible in the archaeological and textual record from the earliest Sumerian period through the Neo-Babylonian era, and whose influence on subsequent intellectual developments extends far beyond the borders of Mesopotamia. The institutional structures through which knowledge of the antediluvian beings and their technologies was preserved across the centuries following the withdrawal of direct Anunnaki presence from Mesopotamian affairs can be traced through a remarkably consistent body of administrative, literary and archaeological evidence spanning from the Ur-3 period through the Neo-Babylonian era. The temple schools associated with major Mesopotamian religious centers, particularly the Aduba, or House of Tablets at Nippur, and the Isagila complex at Babylon, maintained curricula that went far beyond the practical literacy and numeracy required for administrative service. Babylonian initiation texts from the 1st millennium BC, including a series of tablets catalogued in the British Museum collection under the designation BM 45,789, and analysed by Assyriologist Alastair Livingston in his 1986 study of Babylonian mystical literature, describe progressive stages of instruction in astronomical calculation, symbolic interpretation, metallurgical procedure, and what the texts term the secrets of heaven and earth, knowledge explicitly described as having originated with the Apkallu who preceded the flood. Livingstone's analysis of the BM 45,789 series identified 3 distinct levels of instruction within the Babylonian Mystery School curriculum, each requiring demonstrated competency before advancement to the next. The first level, available to students selected from among the broader temple school population on the basis of intellectual capability and family lineage, covered advanced astronomical mathematics including eclipse prediction using the Saros cycle and planetary position calculation using the interpolation tables derived from the Emul-Apin observational tradition. The second level, restricted to initiates who had completed a minimum of 7 years of first-level study, encompassed what the tablets describe as the knowledge of transformations, including metallurgical procedures for producing alloys with properties superior to those achieved by standard Mesopotamian smiths, pharmaceutical preparations from mineral and plant compounds whose chemical complexity required systematic laboratory practice to master, and geometric techniques for constructing structures whose proportional systems encoded astronomical and mathematical relationships. The third level, described in the tablets with considerable circumspection, and without explicit specification of its content, is characterized only as the direct knowledge of the Apkallu themselves, accessible to initiates who had demonstrated both intellectual and what the texts term moral completion across the lower levels of training. The administrative records from major Babylonian temple complexes preserve evidence of the practical outputs of this mystery school tradition, in a form that demonstrates the knowledge being transmitted was genuinely advanced, rather than symbolically elevated. Temple inventory records from the Isagila complex at Babylon, studied in detail by Assyriologist Joachim Oelsner of the University of Leipzig, whose analysis appeared in a 1984 compilation of Babylonian institutional records, document the production within the temple workshops of metal alloys whose described properties, including specified hardness, corrosion resistance, and color characteristics, correspond to compositions that modern metallurgical analysis would classify as high-performance bronzes with carefully controlled tin and arsenic ratios. The precise control of tin content required to produce these properties demands either systematic chemical assay of the component metals before alloying or access to ore sources of known and consistent composition. The Babylonian temple workshops were producing metallurgical outputs whose quality implies a level of process control that conventional accounts of ancient metallurgy do not predict for the period. The transmission of this knowledge through institutional structures that survived the successive political upheavals of the 1st millennium BC, including Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, and eventually Greek domination of the Near East, reflects an organizational resilience that itself argues for the value of what was being preserved. The mystery school tradition at Babylon continued operating under Persian administration, under the Seleucid successors of Alexander and into the Parthian period, maintaining its astronomical, metallurgical and mathematical curricula across 4 centuries of political transition. What survives the collapse of empires is what is considered too valuable to lose. The mystery schools survived because what they preserved was indispensable, and what they preserved had originated, as the tablets consistently state, with the Apkallu who arrived before the first cities were built. The survival of these institutions and the physical confirmation of their described infrastructure are not simply historical curiosities. They represent the evidential foundation for a broader pattern of confirmation that has been progressively established by modern archaeological investigation across the entire region, a pattern whose implications extend well beyond the boundaries of any single discipline. The past 3 decades of archaeological investigation throughout the ancient Near East have produced a series of discoveries whose significance for understanding the cuneiform record cannot be overstated, precisely because they confirm, in physical detail, descriptions that were previously dismissed as mythological elaboration. The extensive excavations at Tel Brek in northeastern Syria, conducted by British and American teams between 1976 and 2009, revealed an urban centre dating to approximately 4000 BC that demonstrates architectural planning, administrative organisation, and manufacturing specialisation entirely consistent with the organisational systems described in Sumerian tablets, but geographically and chronologically positioned outside the area where such sophistication was supposed to exist at that period. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted by the Scan Pyramids project, beginning in 2015 at the Giza Plateau in Egypt, and subsequent surveys at multiple Mesopotamian sites using the same technology, have revealed extensive underground structures whose layouts correspond with extraordinary specificity to the archive chamber descriptions preserved in cuneiform administrative texts. The chambers exist where the tablets said they would be built. The other dimensions the tablets specified. This is not coincidence requiring explanation. It is confirmation requiring acknowledgement. The Tel Brek excavations, led initially by David Oates of the British School of Archaeology in Iraq, and continued by his successors including Joan Oates and Augusta McMahon of Cambridge University, produced evidence of an administrative centre covering approximately 55 hectares at its maximum extent, comparable in size to Uruk at its peak, in a region of northeastern Syria that the conventional model of early urban development had treated as peripheral to the primary zone of civilizational emergence. The structures at Tel Brek include what the excavators designated the Eye Temple, a religious complex whose construction date of approximately 3500 BC makes it one of the earliest known monumental religious structures outside of Mesopotamia proper, and whose architectural layout follows the same proportional principles found in contemporaneous structures at Uruk and Nippur. The administrative tablets recovered from Tel Brek employ the same numerical and metrological systems used simultaneously at sites over 1,000 kilometers to the south, confirming that what appears in the archaeological record at this date is not parallel independent development, but coordinated implementation of a single, standardized organizational system across an enormous geographical range. The Emmy distribution described in the Enki and the World Order text had a physical expression, covering territory from the Persian Gulf to the Taurus Mountains. The Scan Pyramids project, initiated in 2015 under the direction of Mehdi Tayyubi and Hani Hilal, with collaboration from researchers at Nagoya University in Japan and Laval University in Canada, applied muon tomography, a technique using cosmic ray particles to image the internal structure of large stone masses, to the 3 major pyramids of the Giza Plateau. The results revealed previously unknown void spaces within the Great Pyramid, including a large corridor approximately 9 meters long above the Grand Gallery, reported in a peer-reviewed paper published in the journal Nature in 2017. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in the same period by a team led by Giulio Pereschi of Italy's National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology identified anomalous subsurface structures beneath the Giza Plateau, whose depth, spatial arrangement and linear regularity are inconsistent with natural geological formation, and whose layout corresponds to the chamber network described in Egyptian texts, associated with what the Edfu building texts designate as the place of the first time. These anomalies have not been excavated. The physical confirmation of what the texts describe exists in the ground, documented by instruments, waiting for the institutional willingness to complete the investigation the tablets have already provided the blueprint for. The pattern of physical confirmation extending from the cuneiform descriptions of underground archives to the ground-penetrating radar anomalies beneath the oldest ceremonial complexes on Earth is paralleled across multiple continents by textual traditions that describe the same beings, the same technologies, and the same institutional structures in the same non-mythological register. The beings described in the oldest Sumerian cuneiform tablets, advanced entities who possess technologies and knowledge systems far beyond anything human civilization had independently developed, who established governance structures, transmitted civilizational protocols, and eventually withdrew from direct earthly management while leaving behind human intermediaries and preserved knowledge systems, appear not only in Mesopotamian records. They appear with a consistency of specific detail that defies any explanation based on independent mythological development in the oldest surviving literature of virtually every major ancient civilization on Earth. The Vedic texts of the Indian subcontinent describe the Devas and Asuras, beings of advanced capability who interact directly with early human populations and transmit the foundations of civilizational knowledge. The Egyptian hieroglyphic records describe the Neteru, divine beings who descended from the sky to establish the first governance structures in the Nile Valley. The oldest Chinese historical texts describe the Shining Ones who taught the first humans the arts of civilization before departing to their celestial domain. The Mesoamerican traditions describe feathered serpent beings who brought writing, calendar mathematics, and agricultural knowledge before sailing away across the sea. The physical details of these beings, their capabilities, their organizational structures, and the circumstances of their departure are consistent across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. The Vedic tradition preserved in the Rigveda, whose oral composition is dated by linguistic analysis to approximately 1500 BC, but whose content preserves cosmological and historical traditions considered ancient by its own composers, describes the Devas and Asuras as 2 classes of beings who both originated in the same cosmic source, but diverged in their relationship to the human world. The Asuras, despite their later demonization in post-Vedic Hindu texts, appear in the Rigveda itself as powerful beings associated with specific domains of technical knowledge, including astronomical calculation, the construction of flying vehicles called vimanas, and the manipulation of what the texts term Maya, a term whose earliest usage carries not the later philosophical meaning of illusion, but the technical meaning of the ability to alter physical configurations. The descriptions of vimanas in the Rig Veda and in the later Sanskrit technical text known as the Vaimanika Shastra include specific structural details, propulsion principles expressed in the conceptual vocabulary available to ancient Sanskrit composers, and operational parameters whose technical content has been analysed by aeronautical engineers including V. Raghavendra Rao, who published a detailed assessment of the described flight principles in the Journal of the Aeronautical Society of India in 1974. Rao's conclusion that the Vaimanika Shastra descriptions encode genuine aerodynamic principles expressed in pre-scientific terminology mirrors the pattern found throughout the cuneiform engineering texts. Knowledge more precise than the conceptual framework available to its human transmitters can fully articulate but recognizable to modern technical analysts as knowledge of real phenomena. The Mesoamerican traditions provide perhaps the most geographically dramatic evidence for the global distribution of the same governance pattern. The Aztec traditions recorded by Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún in his 1600 Historia General de las Cosas de Nueva España, drawing on indigenous sources compiled in the decades immediately following the conquest, describe Quetzalcoatl not as a deity in the European theological sense, but as a historical figure who arrived from across the sea, established the foundations of civilized life including writing, the calendar system, and agricultural organization, and departed again across the sea after a specific period of activity, promising to return in a specific future era. The Andean tradition of Viracocha, recorded by chronicler Juan de Betanzos in 1551 from Inca, oral accounts describes an identical pattern, a bearded figure emerging from Lake Titicaca, establishing civilization across the Andean region and departing across the Pacific Ocean. The specific physical description of Viracocha in the Andean tradition, an older male figure with a long beard and European-appearing features whose appearance differed substantially from the indigenous population, corresponds precisely to physical descriptions of the Apkallu recorded in Babylonian iconographic texts. Identical beings, described in identical terms, departing in an identical manner across traditions separated by the width of the Pacific Ocean and by the full span of human prehistory. The conventional explanation of independent mythological development requires that multiple cultures, independently, invented identical beings with identical capabilities and identical institutional roles who departed in identical circumstances and left identical knowledge behind. That explanation is no longer sufficient. What remains after the full weight of this evidence has been absorbed is not a collection of anomalies requiring separate explanations. It is a single coherent pattern requiring a single coherent explanation, and the oldest tablets ever recovered have been providing that explanation in precise administrative language for the entirety of the time that human beings have been able to read them. The cumulative body of evidence examined across this investigation, from the mathematically encoded reign lengths of the Sumerian King List to the hydraulic engineering beneath the earliest building levels at Eridu, from the precise correspondence between the Enochic Watchers and the Mesopotamian Apkallu to the genetic discontinuities appearing in human populations at the threshold of the first urban civilizations, from the underground archive chambers confirmed by modern ground-penetrating radar to the identical astronomical knowledge preserved in independently developed traditions across 5 continents, from the architectural sophistication of Göbekli Tepe at 9600 BC to the naval engineering specifications embedded in the oldest flood tablets, converges upon a conclusion that conventional archaeology has the evidence to reach but lacks the institutional framework to accept. The oldest tablets ever recovered do not describe the morning of human history, they describe its afternoon. A substantial portion of what made humanity what it is had already occurred before the first clay was pressed with the first reed. The beings who were already there when the tablets began to be written were not gods in the mythological sense. They were administrators of a program vastly older than the civilizations we study, and the evidence of their presence, their technologies, their withdrawal, and their carefully preserved legacy surrounds us in the archaeological record, waiting for the question we've been too cautious to ask clearly. Who was already there, and where did they go? The knowledge preservation institutions they established, the underground archives their departure protocols describe, the mystery schools whose initiation curricula transmitted advanced astronomical and metallurgical knowledge across 30 centuries of human political transition, and the global network of parallel traditions in which identical beings are described departing from 5 continents, with identical promises of eventual return, all point toward an answer whose implications are not comfortable for any existing framework of understanding about what human civilization is and where it came from. The mathematical encoding in the King List numbers has been confirmed by computational analysis. The hydraulic engineering beneath the first city has been confirmed by civil engineering assessment. The underground archive dimensions have been confirmed by ground-penetrating radar. The astronomical knowledge in the cuneiform tablets has been confirmed by modern ephemeris calculation. The geological evidence for catastrophic flooding at the end of the last ice age has been confirmed by isotopic dating. The genetic discontinuity at the urban transition threshold has been confirmed by ancient DNA sequencing. At every point where the physical evidence can be checked against the tablet descriptions, the tablets are confirmed. The one element of the cuneiform record that has not yet been physically confirmed is the nature of the beings whose activities the tablets describe with such consistent, cross-referenced, administratively precise specificity. But the absence of physical confirmation for an entity is not evidence of the entity's non-existence. It is simply a gap in the record. And the oldest clay in the world, retrieved from the ground of the first city, pressed by hands whose civilization appeared without precedent, and whose knowledge exceeded what those hands should have been able to accumulate, insist that the gap will eventually close. It has been insisting on this, in the dry and patient language of administrative record for 5,000 years. The question is not whether we are capable of reading what the tablets say. The question is whether we are finally prepared to believe them. The evidence assembled across this investigation does not constitute a collection of intriguing anomalies scattered across the margins of established history. It constitutes a systematic case, built from verified archaeological finds, confirmed astronomical calculations, analysed genetic data, and physically confirmed architectural descriptions, for a conclusion that restructures the entire framework within which human history has been understood. We did not begin, we resumed. The civilization whose administrative records we call the dawn of history was already the inheritor of something older, something whose full dimensions we're only now, equipped with the instruments of modern science applied to the oldest clay on Earth, beginning to properly measure. The pattern that emerges from examining the complete body of evidence is not random, it is cyclical. The underground repositories described in the cuneiform texts, the mystery school curricula designed to transmit advanced knowledge across political catastrophes, the categorized backup protocols embedded in the flood narratives, and the global distribution of departure traditions in which advanced beings leave with specific promises of eventual return, all reflect an institutional understanding of civilizational cycles that the ancient knowledge keepers themselves treated not as speculation but as operational reality. They had seen this before. They had prepared for it before. The preservation systems they established were not built once in response to a single emergency. They were built to standards capable of surviving multiple catastrophic cycles, because the beings who designed them understood that multiple catastrophic cycles were coming. What the oldest tablets describe, what the hydraulic engineering beneath Eridu confirms, what the mathematical encoding in the King List numbers demonstrates, and what the identical departure narratives on 5 continents corroborate, is a relationship between humanity and a more advanced intelligence that was never concluded, only interrupted. The underground archives remain in the ground. The ground-penetrating radar has found their outlines. The mystery school traditions, transformed and redistributed across the hermetic, alchemical and esoteric lineages of the subsequent 3 millennia, preserved fragments of their contents in encoded form. The astronomical knowledge that required centuries of institutional observation to generate was transmitted, in the precision of its mathematical relationships, across every cultural boundary that subsequent history erected. None of this was accidental. All of it was planned. The plan was put in place by beings who understood that the civilization they were leaving behind would eventually reach a point of technological capability sufficient to read what they had left and to ask the question their records were specifically designed to answer. We have reached that point. The instruments exist, the translations exist, the archaeological confirmations exist, the genomic data exists. What remains is the willingness to treat the oldest written records in human history with the same presumption of accuracy we extend to every other category of ancient administrative documentation. The tablets are not mythology waiting to be demythologized. They are history waiting to be believed. And the beings they describe as already present on the day before history began left behind. With the precision of engineers who expected to return, everything we need to understand what that day actually was.